During Prohibition, the U.S. government took a shocking step to stop Americans from drinking. It poisoned the alcohol supply. Knowing people were still consuming industrial liquor, officials added deadly chemicals, leading to the deaths of over 10,000 people. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate policy. This is the hidden story of how law enforcement turned lethal and how morality cost thousands their lives. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was a nation in cultural and moral turmoil. Rapid industrialization had transformed cities into hubs of opportunity and vice. Saloon culture, especially in urban centers, was booming. Men often spent their wages on liquor, leaving families to suffer the consequences. To many reformers, alcohol symbolized everything that was wrong with modern society: broken homes, joblessness, crime, and the decay of religious and family values. It was in this climate that the temperance movement gained momentum, led by organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League. Their tireless lobbying efforts tapped into the anxieties of the time, portraying alcohol as the greatest threat to American morality. After years of escalating political pressure, their crusade finally succeeded. In 1919, Congress ratified the 18th Amendment, banning the manufacture, sale, and transport of all alcoholic beverages. The law took effect on January 17, 1920, with the passage of the Volstead Act, which strictly defined what constituted an intoxicating beverage: anything over 0.5% alcohol content. But the vision of a sober, crime-free America quickly unraveled. Far from being a solution, Prohibition sparked one of the most lawless, rebellious, and dangerous eras in U.S. history. Almost overnight, alcohol went underground. Bootlegging, the illegal production and sale of alcohol, became a booming industry. Secret bars known as speakeasies sprang up by the thousands. Moonshiners and rum runners trafficked illicit booze across state lines and international borders. Police forces were underpaid and often bribed to look the other way. Meanwhile, the criminal underworld exploded in power, with violent gangs like Al Capone's in Chicago rising to dominance through control of the illegal liquor trade. Homicide rates climbed. Corruption infected law enforcement and politics at every level. The noble dream of reform had unleashed a dark, unintended reality. For ordinary Americans, Prohibition didn't mean sobriety. It just meant inconvenience and risk. Drinking didn't stop. It simply shifted to basements, attics, hidden clubs, and alleyways. The upper classes still drank champagne in secret, while the working poor often resorted to cheaper, sometimes dangerous alternatives. In short, the law had no real power without the public's cooperation, and the public had decided to ignore it. As law enforcement struggled to keep up with the tidal wave of illegal alcohol, government officials turned their attention to a specific vulnerability in the system: industrial alcohol. This substance, ethanol used in manufacturing processes, remained legal, as it was crucial for producing paint, cleaning products, antifreeze, solvents, and more. It was not meant for drinking, and to deter misuse, the government required it to be denatured or laced with chemicals to make it taste bad or induce vomiting. But bootleggers saw an opportunity. With the right equipment and knowledge, these chemicals could be removed or chemically altered, turning the industrial alcohol into something once again consumable, albeit still risky. It was cheaper, easier to acquire, and ideal for mass production. This renatured alcohol was then diluted, flavored, and bottled as fake whiskey, gin, or rum. In major cities, industrial alcohol became the foundation of the bootlegging economy, responsible for nearly 2/3 of the illegal liquor circulating across the country. The U.S. government was aware of this loophole but found itself helpless to close it. Thousands of industrial plants produced legal alcohol for legitimate purposes, making regulation a logistical nightmare. Treasury agents were overwhelmed and often outmaneuvered by chemists hired by the mob. The bootleggers had essentially industrialized their operations, running covert factories with the sophistication of corporate enterprises. In desperation, the government made a chilling decision. If the bootleggers couldn't be stopped, the alcohol itself would be weaponized. Starting in 1926, under the direction of the Bureau of Prohibition, The Treasury Department mandated that new, deadlier poisons be added to industrial alcohol, specifically methyl alcohol, methanol, a substance that attacks the nervous system and can cause blindness, organ failure, and death in even small amounts. This wasn't an accidental contamination. It was a deliberate policy designed to make drinking so dangerous that people would finally stop. Officials justified the decision by saying that those who drank bootleg alcohol were knowingly breaking the law and assumed the risk. But in truth, most people had no idea how deadly their drinks had become. Many assumed it was just low-quality liquor, not a government-sanctioned toxin. Thus began a grim chapter in American history, a state-led poisoning campaign that would ultimately kill thousands of U.S. citizens. And as the death toll climbed, so did the moral outrage, raising disturbing questions about how far a government should go to enforce its laws. By the mid-1920s, the U.S. government was under immense pressure. Prohibition, instead of curbing alcohol consumption, had driven it deeper into the shadows and into the hands of criminal empires. The government's enforcement agencies were overwhelmed, underfunded, and often outsmarted by the rapidly growing bootleg liquor industry. Frustrated with the failure of traditional law enforcement methods, federal authorities decided to take an unprecedented and ethically controversial step: to poison the alcohol supply itself. In 1926, the Bureau of Prohibition, working under the U.S. Treasury Department, mandated the addition of methyl alcohol, commonly known as wood alcohol, to industrial-grade ethanol. Methyl alcohol is a potent neurotoxin. Even in small doses, it can cause permanent blindness, kidney failure, hallucinations, or death. The idea wasn't to kill people per se, but to make drinking industrial alcohol so dangerous that no bootlegger would dare touch it and no consumer would dare drink it. But that's not what happened. Instead of being deterred, bootleggers continued to buy and repurpose industrial alcohol. Driven by greed and high demand, they tried to purify it as they had before, often using primitive and imprecise methods that failed to remove the methanol. The poison stayed in the alcohol, undetectable, tasteless, and deadly. This toxic liquor was then distributed in large quantities through bars, street vendors, and speakeasies. The first wave of deaths came suddenly and shockingly. In New York City alone, more than 400 people died in a single year from poisoned alcohol. Hospitals began to see a horrifying trend: patients arriving with vomiting, blindness, seizures, or slipping into comas after just a few drinks. Many didn't survive. Those who did were often left permanently damaged, blind, or disabled for life. Doctors and chemists raised alarm bells. Medical professionals were outraged, calling the policy barbaric. The American Medical Association condemned it. Public health officials described it as an act of war against the American people. But the federal government defended the policy, claiming the victims had been breaking the law and brought it upon themselves. Even more chilling was the fact that this was not a one-time act. The poisoning campaign continued for years, even as the body count grew. Between 1926 and 1933, estimates suggest over 10,000 people died as a direct result of poisoned alcohol, with countless more injured or permanently disabled. This was no longer a health crisis. It was a national tragedy, born not from neglect or accident, but from deliberate policy. A democratic government had chosen to endanger its own citizens to enforce an unpopular law. And the worst was still to come. As the poisoned alcohol continued to circulate, the true scale of the human toll became undeniable. News of the deaths began to reach the front pages of major newspapers. The New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and Washington Post all ran pieces exposing the federal government's role in the crisis. Headlines like "U.S. Government Indifferent to Alcohol Deaths" and "Treasury's Poison Liquor Policy Condemned" painted a damning portrait of a nation willing to sacrifice its citizens on the altar of law and order. The public outcry grew, but it was divided. While many were horrified by the death toll and the government's heartlessness, others, especially Prohibition hardliners, defended the strategy. They believed that anyone who consumed alcohol during Prohibition was a criminal and deserved the consequences. These voices claimed that the government had a duty to uphold the law by any means necessary, but the statistics told a crueler story. The victims were overwhelmingly poor, working-class Americans. Wealthy elites had access to imported or specially preserved private stock of alcohol and could afford safer, cleaner liquor. The poor, on the other hand, turned to what they could find: cheap, bootlegged liquor, often produced from poisoned industrial alcohol. For many of these individuals, a glass of gin or whiskey wasn't a luxury. It was a momentary escape from depression, hunger, or despair. And for thousands, it was their last. The poisoned alcohol did not discriminate, but the policy behind it did. While the government argued it was simply modifying industrial products, critics labeled the strategy as state-sponsored murder. Human rights activists, journalists, clergy, and even some members of Congress began to question whether prohibition enforcement had gone too far. One notable critic, Alice Hamilton, a physician and expert in toxicology, wrote scathing reports, highlighting how toxic the additives were and how many lives had been lost due to the policy. Despite this, the poisoning continued. The federal government doubled down, adding even more toxic chemicals to industrial alcohol blends in the late 1920s. These included chloroform, formaldehyde, kerosene, and acetone, a chemical cocktail guaranteed to do irreparable harm. Some bootleggers tried to warn customers, while others added sugar and perfume to mask the taste. But for most victims, by the time the symptoms appeared, it was already too late. By the early 1930s, the debate had reached its moral breaking point. More and more Americans believed that the government had lost its soul trying to save the country's morality. When the death toll reached into the thousands, Prohibition, once a symbol of purity and national discipline, had come to represent hypocrisy, cruelty, and mass suffering. By the time the public became widely aware of the U.S. government's deliberate poisoning program, the country was already wrestling with a deep ethical crisis. What began as a bold attempt to enforce prohibition had spiraled into a national scandal that called into question the very principles upon which the American government was founded. Was it ever justifiable for a democratic state to knowingly endanger the lives of its citizens to uphold a moral law? And if so, where should the line be drawn? Legal scholars, ethicists, and civil rights advocates began to weigh in. Constitutional lawyers argued that the government had grossly overstepped its legal boundaries by weaponizing a public health policy without public consent. Unlike war, where enemy combatants are targeted, this policy had harmed law-abiding citizens who had no involvement in bootlegging. Many of the victims were unaware that the alcohol they consumed contained deadly poisons. There had been no public warning, no formal regulation mandating consumer disclosures, and no clear accountability. These were not criminals. They were victims of a state-led silent war. From an ethical standpoint, the criticism was even more severe. Medical professionals condemned the poisoning strategy as a direct violation of the Hippocratic Oath and public health ethics. Influential voices, like Dr. Charles Norris, New York City's chief medical examiner, openly accused the federal government of murder. He and his team documented cases of death by poisoned alcohol, carefully tracing them back to the methanol-infused industrial supply, proving the connection in clinical autopsies and forensic reports. Norris declared that if a foreign nation had done what the U.S. government was doing to its own people, it would be considered an act of war. But what stung even more was the class and racial bias evident in the policy's execution and its consequences. Wealthy individuals, politicians, and celebrities continued to drink high-quality smuggled liquor, largely unaffected by the poisons in industrial alcohol. Meanwhile, poor urban neighborhoods and immigrant communities, already marginalized, bore the brunt of the death toll. The poisoning campaign, critics argued, didn't just enforce prohibition. It targeted the vulnerable, reinforcing America's growing inequalities. Despite mounting protests, the federal government never issued an official apology for the poisoning campaign. There were no trials, no firings, no compensations for victims' families. The policy quietly faded from public memory as attention shifted toward the collapse of the economy during the Great Depression. But the scars remained, both in the families who lost loved ones and in the collective trust Americans placed in their institutions. The poisoned alcohol campaign became a cautionary tale in the annals of U.S. history, a dark reminder that when morality and power are pursued without accountability, even the most democratic governments can become dangerous. As the 1930s progressed, the once popular dream of a sober, crime-free America had become a national nightmare. Prohibition had failed, spectacularly. Instead of eliminating alcohol, it had driven it underground, enriching criminals, corrupting law enforcement, and killing innocent Americans. The public mood was shifting. The deaths from poisoned alcohol, the rise in organized crime, and the inability of the government to control the chaos led to a widespread sense of disillusionment. People began to ask, was it worth it? At the same time, America was plunging into the Great Depression. Millions were unemployed. Bread lines stretched down city blocks. The government desperately needed new sources of revenue, and one was staring them in the face: alcohol taxes. Legalizing alcohol could bring in much-needed funds, stimulate job creation in the brewing and distilling industries, and weaken the grip of organized crime. Public and political support for prohibition began to crumble. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for president on a platform that included repealing prohibition. His message was clear: the nation needed economic recovery, not moral crusades. His landslide victory was a mandate for change. In 1933, just months into his presidency, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing the 18th and officially ending prohibition, the first and only time in U.S. history that a constitutional amendment was overturned by another. The end of prohibition was met with widespread celebration. Bars reopened, breweries restarted, and Americans returned to drinking, this time legally. But the legacy of the Prohibition era lingered. The thousands of lives lost to the poisoned alcohol program were never officially acknowledged by the government. No reparations were offered. No public memorials were built. It remained for decades a shameful secret of American policy, one that historians would later uncover as a grim example of how far the state can go when it believes the ends justify the means. Today, the poisoned alcohol campaign is studied, not just as a cautionary tale of enforcement gone wrong, but as a powerful reflection of what happens when public health is used as a weapon and when human life becomes expendable in the pursuit of ideology. It remains one of the darkest and most unsettling episodes in the American experiment. In the decades following the repeal of prohibition, America moved on, but quietly. There were no congressional hearings about the poisoned alcohol deaths. No federal agency issued a statement of remorse. History textbooks largely ignored the episode. Survivors and families of victims were left to grieve in silence. The government's role in the deaths of over 10,000 Americans was buried beneath the triumph of the 21st Amendment and the narrative that prohibition had simply been a failed policy, not a lethal one. Only later, through the work of investigative journalists and independent historians, did the full scope of the poisoning campaign come to light. Archival documents, internal memos from the Bureau of Prohibition, and death records from city hospitals began to paint a clearer picture. This wasn't collateral damage. It was premeditated. The additives chosen, methyl alcohol, chloroform, benzene, nitrobenzene, weren't merely deterrents. They were known killers, and they were used in high enough concentrations that government chemists warned of their deadly effects before they were approved. As these facts surfaced, a new generation of Americans was forced to ask uncomfortable questions. Was it justified? Was prohibition a noble cause that lost its way, or a misguided crusade from the start? And more importantly, what does it say about the balance between public morality and human life? These were no longer historical footnotes. They were ethical case studies, revisited by legal scholars, public health experts, and political theorists, in classrooms and publications across the country. The episode also raised critical parallels with modern policies. When governments act in the name of public welfare or national morality, how far can they go before crossing the line into tyranny? What rights do citizens have to transparency when state power becomes punitive? These questions remain highly relevant today, especially in debates over surveillance, drug enforcement, vaccine mandates, and civil liberties. The poisoned alcohol campaign remains a sobering reminder that the machinery of the state, once set in motion without moral restraint, can become indistinguishable from the oppression it claims to fight. The story of how the U.S. government poisoned its own people is not just a dark chapter, it's a moral warning. During Prohibition, the state believed it could legislate morality, enforce temperance, and purify the soul of the nation through force. But what it unleashed was a wave of unintended consequences: crime, corruption, mass suffering, and thousands of needless deaths. What began as a social experiment ended as a human tragedy. Prohibition didn't stop Americans from drinking, it just made drinking deadly. And instead of admitting defeat, the government doubled down with poison. The men who signed off on the chemical formulas believed they were saving the country, but they had forgotten the most fundamental principle of democracy, that the state exists to protect life, not to gamble with it. In the end, Prohibition failed not only as policy, but as a test of American ethics. The poisoned alcohol campaign stands as a brutal reminder that even a government of the people can cross lines that are difficult to forgive and impossible to forget.